Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. We start work at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. The topic of the first briefing, large-scale arrests in Crimea in March 2019. What is the current situation with detainees and what kind of help they need? Edem Semedliayev, lawyer of the political detainees. And Azamatov, lawyer of activist Murtaza, detained in March 2019. Halide Bekirova, spouse of journalist Remzi Bekirov, detained in March 2019, and Refat Chubarov, MP, head of Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, and our moderator. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm Maria Tomak, and I'm human rights activist, and also I participate in the USA program to protect human rights. And today we are going to speak about the case about 24 people. This is about the largest arrest from the occupation, from the start of occupation of Crimea. And many of these people are participants of Crimean Solidarity Initiative. And all the field was cleared in Crimea in the course of occupation, and such initiatives that appear that are human rights defenders initiatives, they are under pressure, and today we're going to speak with families and lawyers of activists in the framework of this case of 24. And we have limited space on the scene, and in the hall, Fatima Yanikova is present. This is a woman, and from her family, her relatives, male relatives, were taken away, and also Zamanova, and out of 24 people who were detained, 3 people were beaten, tortured, what we call illegal methods of investigations. They were brought to 5 pretrial detention facilities in Rostov-Shakhty and Taganrog in the territory of Russia, and plus there are people in Simferopol pretrial detention facility, 1 person. Here I would like to give the floor to Edem Semedliayev, lawyer who works in many cases that are political in Crimea and coordinates the work of defense in the framework of the case of 24. Thank you very much. I'm Edem Semedliayev, I'm the lawyer. Why this case is unique? Before 27th of March, there were no large-scale detentions and arrests. Why do we call it seizures? Because these actions are illegal. People break into the houses early in the morning. They know that there are small children and pregnant women in the house. They turn all the house out, and people, they have guns, and they detain a person, take this person away, and this is all after this investigation starts. So, first criminal cases were started on the 24 people, 23 were arrested, and 1 person, we do not know about him, where he is. In a month, 1 more person was detained, Raimay. In his house, there were no arrests. No case against him was started. After 27th of March, he entered Ukraine and returned back, and in a month, He was detained at the border at night. He was detained for 3 hours at the border. Then FSB officers came and he brought him into the field and started to humiliate him, threatened him, morally pressured him, and fired into the air. They said that they would kill him and he would disappear. And they asked him to give some evidences, and after this, he rejected these evidences. He said that some torture was used against him. So this is the case of torture, intimidation, and moral pressure in this case. And despite all of this, we were able to form 24 human rights advocates group, and one of them is from Moscow and all others are from Crimea. They now defend Crimean Tatars. What else can I say about this case? So this is the pressure on Crimean Tatars, Crimean Solidarity Initiative. The majority of these people who were detained were active participants of Crimean Solidarity Initiative. Some of them were more public, others were not public. But, for example, they provided parcels to prisoners, helped families, and there are journalists and human rights defenders in this group. You should understand that these people are isolated by Russia, and Russia tries to show that it doesn't worth to highlight, to cover those processes that are ongoing. They try to prevent help to political prisoners and their families. So all these actions are directed towards this goal. Next, I would like to give the floor to the representative of one of the families from which the activist was taken away. This Halide Bekirova, spouse of journalist Remzi Bekirov, detained in among all those 24 people who were detained. I would like to thank the families who come here to Kiev, who tell us information about this. So this can be really active. And this is not a panacea, but it is important to bring this information, to tell people about what is going on. And I would like to ask you to tell us your story, because before the arrest of your husband, as I understand, this was not the first case when some issues were raised by FSB or law enforcement bodies of occupation authorities. There were some searches. Tell us, please, about your story and about your husband. What is his condition now? So I am a spouse of Remzi Bekirov. He is a civic activist of Crimean Solidarity and a journalist, correspondent of internet media Granitru. He has high education. He graduated from history department of Tavria University, named after Vernadsky. Many times he was under pressure because of his active civic position. In 2017, there was an administrative arrest 5 days because he came to the search of Mirza Mustafayev. He came to cover the search, to support his friend, and for this he was arrested. In 2017, also there was administrative arrest, 3 days. The reason was repost in Contact of 7 years in the deleted account. This repost was made when there was Ukrainian rule, and it was not covered a lot. So he felt pressure because of his activity. And in the result, on the 27th of March this year, in our house, there was a search. Remzi was arrested and deported to Rostov-on-Don pretrial detention facility, where he is now. He was always active, and when his relatives insisted and said that he should stop coverage of courts and searches, he said, "Who else but me?" And today, this is a pain in our family, and this is not only the pain of the families of political prisoners, and not only of Crimean Tatar people. This is pain of the world community. Today, the world should respond to violations of human rights in Crimea committed by Russia. Otherwise, tomorrow, these illegal actions will be spread. So if we are speaking about searches carried out in our house, I would like to note that there were many violations in the course of the search. They broke in at 6 a.m. in our house, and they threatened the children and parents that were sleeping, and officers felt impunity. They turned everything out, the clothes, books, wallets. They searched through everything. They prohibited me to speak in the Crimean Tatar language, but this is my native language and state language in the territory of Crimea. A lawyer who was in the street was not allowed to come in, and they planted some books that are prohibited in the territory of Russia. They confiscated hard disk and also notebook of my son and tablet and telephone. And an investigator tried to humiliate my religious feelings, and he also pressured on my mother feelings in his own interests. And in the end of the search, he forced me to sign a protocol in which a lot of violations were put in. So this is just a drop in the sea of repressions in relation to independent journalism in Crimea. Starting 2014, in the territory of the peninsula, a large-scale campaign was launched to undermine free media. And in the framework of this case, broadcasting of Ukrainian channels was blocked. Radio was blocked, and the first RTA channel was brought to mainland Ukraine. Also, they blocked access to many internet resources. And on the backdrop of such repressions, an Institute of Civil Journalism was formed. Common citizens who are unindifferent towards the situation that exists started to actively use the media and publish their materials. These were photos from the court hearings, streams from searches and the mass arrests. This was an interview from those who suffered from abuse committed by law enforcers, and articles about abuse. And they risked their lives, and despite threats and arrests, fines, psychological pressure, they continue to do their work. And Remzi was one of them. He understood that he risks his freedom, and despite this, he didn't went back, he continued his activity, and he continued his struggle for freedom and faith of his people. Thank you. Before giving the floor to Aider Azamatov, I would like to say that together with my colleague, we updated our lists, and as of today, the information that we have, we are speaking about 115 people who are persecuted in the territory of Crimea and Russian Federation, those who are in pre-trial detention facilities. Among those 115, 63 are Crimean Tatars, and 38 are convicted, and others are in pre-trial facilities. Aider is the lawyer of one of the activists, Seyran Murtaza. I would like to ask him details about the violations that you record in these cases. And previous speakers said about searches and that lawyers were not allowed to be present. What are the stage of investigation now? And is this one case or separate cases? And what are the charges? Who are suspected organizers? And what will be the alleged terms of imprisonment for these people?
Good afternoon. My name is Halide Azamatov. I am a lawyer of one of the 24 detainees who were detained on 29th of March 2019. First, I would like to tell about our common stand of our defense lawyers. From the very beginning of the detentions until today, we were regulated, we were governed by the 4th Geneva Convention. According to the Geneva Convention, all the Crimean citizens who are in the territory of Crimea, they are not allowed to be brought outside of Crimea. So this is a violation of Geneva Convention that they have been brought to Rostov and Rostov region of Russia in the court sittings on preventive measure, prolongation or choice our the detainees say that they are subject to the Geneva Convention, and these regulations should apply to them, and they are citizens of Ukraine. The international community condemned all the actions that happened in 2014, and in the resolution of 2016, the global community demand from the Russian Federation to apply the 4th Geneva Convention to Crimean citizens. Article 4 of the convention bans bringing the citizens of Crimea to any other country. As concerns the violations which were registered, lawyers are not allowed to be present at the searches. There was no single case where the lawyer would have been allowed. 24 persons were in unknown for us place for 3 days. And no written messages were sent to us and the members of families of the 24 persons that they were taken out of Crimea to another territory. We found them by our own efforts, although the Russian Federation's legislation supposes and demands to communicate the information if a detainee is brought to other territory or other region of Russia. When they are in pre-trial detention center, they are kept in the cells. Seyran Murtaza, my defender, he is in the in Taganrog pre-trial detention center since March. He is kept in an isolated cell. This is not allowed even according to the Russian Federation legislation, despite the constitution of the Russian Federation, which which makes international law dominating over the Russian Federation's law. The Russian Federation is not willing to comply with the requirements of international community. All this is connected only to the context of this case. Our detainees, the defendants, they are including Seyran Murtaza. He is supposed to be convicted and sentenced to from 10 to 20 years, or from 15 years to life sentence.
My client.
Yes. Because they talked about their religion in a public place. This is the only accusation. They were not preparing any terrorist attack, no conflict they were preparing. They just talked about their religious convictions. Thank you. I'd like to say that in fact the absolute majority of those who are persecuted in Crimea and Russia, the absolute majority of them is been persecuted under anti-extremist and anti-terrorist legislation of the Russian Federation. This is used to create distrust to political prisoners. So both the lawyers and members of their families are now in Kiev to meet the delegation of the European Union delegation to Ukraine and the other representatives of other institutions. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Refat Chubarov, an MP, to comment on the situation, how the state can support the families and the political prisoners themselves. Thank you very much. Look, when I responded to the invitation of the organizers of this event, I thought, what can I say which we have not yet said, but it was not heard, and I have not found anything which we already all articulated during the 5 years. However, I would like to make some accents to focus your attention on, to pass to details of this tragic reality of those who stay in Crimea. First, Crimean Tatars were those who, in organized way, stood against the Russian occupation from the very first hours of this occupation. And the methods were not violent, but they were open. All attempts of the Russian occupants in any way to bring Crimean Tatars to their side failed. Now, being occupants, they have only one task. They want to squeeze Crimean unloyal people out of the territory of Crimea. And they have already identified who are those persons. They are Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. So until Crimea is occupied, they would do everything to force Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians to leave Crimea. In the 21st century, they cannot imprison everyone like they did in 1944. They deported the whole nation to Siberia. So by intimidation, they try to force people to leave their native land. This is not know-how of Russian occupants. The same happened during the times of Russian Empire. People were persecuted and land was seized, and also religious persecutions were in place, so hundreds of people those days left Crimea. Those arrests in March of this year, we should make actions very strictly. They were large scale. Within one day they conducted 29 searches. They were real raids. 20 persons were detained, and then 3 persons, and then after one day 1 more person. So that was the scale record, the most large-scale sweeping arrests. As far as I remember, I can name every detainee, but this list is so long that I should now look into the list because I start forgetting every surname. This is a terrifying fact because when the number of prisoners is so large, they become a kind of background, and what family members can feel. Could you imagine when your father, your brother, your son is not named? Often people write to me, why you did not mention my father or my brother. This is because only reading this list will take 15 or 20 minutes. So I want journalists to cover the atmosphere, the settings in Crimea, and the expectations of Crimean people from Ukrainian society and Ukrainian government. You are journalists and you can cover this climate, and you can cheer up the Crimean society somehow, so that people in Ukraine do not forget about the fates of people in Crimea. So the number of detainees grew largely. The formats of repression, if we think about the specific situations, they are those that are not present in any civilized country. I am telling this because I would like now to shift to the issue of our relationship with Western countries. Aivaz Raimov is 24 years old. He was detained at Kalanchak. They took out the plate number of their car, and the officer subjected him to a mock execution. He was nailed, and the gun was shot at him, and he is a young person. And he said about this mock execution in public, in court. So he was enough brave to tell about this mock execution. I would like now to say that we should not get used to what is happening in Crimea. There is another way of execution here, or talking about Edem Bekirov, who was arrested when he entered Crimea to see his mother. He has only one leg, and he uses prostheses. In January 2014, he had surgery on heart surgery, and he has diabetes. So being a diabetic person, he cannot bring even anything which weight is more than 4 kilos, and he was made a fake extremist and terrorist. They took all tests from him in a forced way. It was understood at that moment that of course his DNA would coincide with the DNA on explosives. It was understandable from the very first moment that this fake evidence would be used against him. So these weeks, every day, he is beaten so that he accused himself that he has made explosives and tried to make an explosion after command of Islamov and Chubarov. But this case, those who are unwilling, of course, even if he says that he is guilty, if he confesses of guilt, of course he would be punished. So far he is brave. He has not confessed of his guilt. Then this investigator would be easier to kill this guy. Yesterday, one of our lawyers visited his client, a young person. He was a coordinator of Crimean Solidarity. Maria and other people knows him. He is always positive. Nariman Mamedinov, and he they made some records of their cases. They record when they were interrogated, because when you say at the court sitting that for 1.5 years I am in the detention center and I was called only 5 times for 15 minutes. So then it is important when everything is supported by the records, and their records were seized. This is a form of pressure on them. This is an attempt to complicate their defense. Going back to this March days in March 2019, these persons were detained and immediately sent to Taganrog and Rostov-on-Don, not only because the so-called military circuit court is located there. These persons are tried at special courts which are allowed to try cases of extremism and terrorism, and this is also the way to complicate any visits by members of families. Because even if you try to go to Rostov 3 or 4 times, it would mean high costs. So this is done to create complications so that people become desperate, starting with members of family and ending with political prisoners themselves, not talking about children of these prisoners. 171 children are children of the political prisoners. So, and many of them have not seen their newly born babies. All this is evident that the Russian Federation makes systemic pressure which has been growing, and the goal of this pressure is to make people silent, absolutely keeping their mouths shut and never saying a word against the occupant regime, against the occupation regime, and to make every effort to force people to leave Crimea. So we know that this is one of the methods to make our children flee. This is not the goal to explain the situation in Crimea in general. They replace the citizens. They bring Russians from Russia and locate them. They relocate them from Russia to Crimea. What should we do? If I know any answer by points like 1, 2, 3, it would be easier. I know we should continue doing what we were doing all those years. We should seek support from our international partners, but we now face problems in the Council of Europe in particular. It is not excluded that in June the powers of the Russian Federation at the Parliamentary Assembly could be restored. I would like to address every partner, every our partner all over the world. It would be in indulgence to the repressions which the Russian Federation conducted in Crimea and in occupied territories of other regions of Ukraine. So then the Russian Federation will be able to strengthen its repressions, because the Council of Europe may give them an indulgence not only human rights activists and defenders and advocates should work on this. The general situation in Ukraine is also an important factor. We give many grounds for the Western partners to excuse themselves because they say Ukraine is doing something in a non-correct manner. We would continue. Our defenders, our lawyers, they should be praised much because they have been doing their best, but the lawyers and the members of family and the civil society which are grouping around them, they try to withstand this pressure and to I would like to finalize my speech. I do not know what will be next steps of the newly elected president and the new regime in Ukraine. The Верховна Rada will be re-elected soon. This political situation in Ukraine for at least 3 months would be vague, and this would not be helpful for Crimean detainees. Ukrainian society is now focused on their problems on continental territory, and the situation of people in Crimea is not of much interest now. It is not on political agenda. But it depends on us. That is why I now call on journalists to cover as much as possible the situation in Crimea, the repressions in Crimea. This coverage will place this issue on political agenda and agenda of society. So I would like to stop at this issue. I'm pessimistic about the qualitative composition of a new parliament, which we expect, but we hope that we will be cooperating with Ukrainian advocacy institutions and civil society, because human rights organizations in Ukraine are very intensively growing and building their capacity. So they are our partners with whom we address the issues of repressions. We try to minimize repressions. So that is a big question to which Ukrainian state should find an answer. If the response of Ukrainian society can resolve the issue only in cooperation with international community, then Ukrainian state should find the ways how to engage the international community, how to do that. There is no answer now. There is no targeted everyday efforts. They are lacking now. Thank you, Mr. Refat Chubarov. Before giving the floor to you, our colleagues, we as advocacy NGOs, we will continue to press for adoption of the law which would allow to release the prisoners in Crimea and in the Russian Federation, and we will continue working with the newly elected president, and we had the draft documents which were presented to the previous president. Tomorrow there will be a rally in support of the political prisoners. It will start at 12 o'clock at noon tomorrow from Shevchenko's monument. And the report of Truth Hounds and Ukrainian Helsinki Union and other organizations, they have already drafted the report on repressions. It will be presented soon.
Please raise your hands and introduce yourself first. Marina Bukhan, 1+1 TSN News. I have a clarification to IDER. So, what is the title of the article? So this is Article 205.5. This is an article in the law of Russian Federation on terror. So this is about the case of Hizb ut-Tahrir. They call it the case of Hizb ut-Tahrir, based on decision of 2003. This organization is prohibited. If we analyze this decision made by the Supreme Court, it was done under closed doors, behind closed doors. It includes about 12 or 13 other organizations. They are different from Hizb ut-Tahrir. Those organizations, there were evidence against him. For example, Taliban, they came to Russian Federation and met with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this organization was recognized as a terror organization in the territory of Russian Federation, and they came there freely, and no one bring them to justice. And they meet with people, and these organizations, evidence were found that they committed some terror acts or murders. If we take Hizb ut-Tahrir in this decision of the Supreme Court, there are no such things. Why they included Hizb ut-Tahrir in this list, we do not know. Only those people who participated in the process understand this. So this article is 205.5. So these organizations that are prohibited by Russian Federation, all those who were arrested, those 24 people, are they in one case? Why were they sent to 5 pre-trial detention facility? Maybe this is one process, or they just detained separately. All 24, we know where they are. One is missing. We do not know where he is. All 25 people are in one case. 5 or 6 people are accused of organizing and others are participants. And why they were brought from Crimea, the investigation explains that in pre-trial detention facility in Simferopol, they do not have place for these people. That's why, in order to adhere to legislation concerning these people, they cannot put them in one cell. They should put them in separate cells to prevent communication among them. And the FSB also responded that there was such a need to bring these people out of Crimea. But as I've said, even in this situation, these are not problems of the relatives and our clients and lawyers. If there is no place in the pretrial detention facility, they shouldn't send them there. There are other ways, other preventive measures, for example, home arrests, and also they may sign a document that they won't leave. Unfortunately, pre-trial investigators, they put these people in custody, and they make the situation worse for the visits of relatives and parcels from relatives. In order to go to Taganrog, we lose about 3 days to come there to see those people, and also court hearings, appeals, and we believe that the investigative actions also will continue in Rostov and in the Rostov region. So as I understand, you and your colleague represent the interests also our Marines that were imprisoned in Russia. And we hope that this decision of tribunal was made, and we hope that they will be released on the 25th of June. And what about other Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars detained in Crimea? And what can be done, in your opinion? What is lacking? I will continue. And Maria Tomak mentioned that the legal status of these persons should be defined, because there is no proper law on this. Some normative acts are lacking that identify their status. During these 5 years, they are political prisoners, and all human rights defenders believe that they are political prisoners. And the memorial also identified them as political prisoners. But at the level of the state, there is no such law. They say in courts that they are political prisoners and they are persecuted due to political reasons, no other reason. And Ukraine should consider the law to provide status of political prisoner. There should be a law that provides and regulates this area. First, the legislation should identify their legal status. We won't say that some organization recognize them. The state should recognize them officially, that they are political prisoners. And at the international platforms, this would improve the position of these people, because they say that the norms of international law should be used in their cases. The Fourth Geneva Convention regulates the status. And in Ukraine, there is no proper law that would regulate their status. That's why, additionally, we should adopt such legislation. I would like to add about draft law. I won't go into detail, but there are documents developed by NGOs and the Human Rights Defenders Organization, and I also spotted this idea that they envisaged support for the families of those who were detained, because we understand that families face terrible problems with finances and other problems, and also rehabilitation after release, because when people are released, they are nowhere and with nothing, especially those who have registration and their houses are in the occupied territory. So there should be minimum support and rehabilitation. There shouldn't be a matter of political will. This should be the matter of the legislation. I would like to add, you all understand that Russia violates international law and opinion and condemnation, and it maximally tries to behave in such a way they try to get understanding by West, and nearly all persecutions that are carried out in the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimea, Russia tries to provide explanations and motivation, and the legislation of Russia supports this. They started fight with terror, and it became the overall world problem. And at the backdrop of those events in Caucasus and Chechnya, they created a number of articles, and now they try to use these articles in Crimea about terrorism, about extremism. And in Balakh, he raised Ukrainian flag, and he openly provided his position. So they planted some explosives and other illegal things to him, and in order to convict him of terrorism. And the Mejlis was prohibited by the local court and by the Supreme Court of Russian Federation. And you know that in April 2017, there was an intermediary decision of the International Court, and Russia was obliged to immediately cancel its decision concerning ban on the activity of Mejlis and ban of free entry and exit of members of Mejlis to Crimea and from Crimea, and this decision was not implemented. On the 3rd or 2nd, maybe 3rd of June, there will be a week of International Court hearing, and they will consider the issue of Russian declaration about non-competence of International Court, to consider the issues of those conventions based on which decision was taken to cancel ban on Mejlis. So Russia maximally try to influence those international platforms, and they try to do the same with Tribunal on Maritime Law. They always, everywhere, try to show that this is not the competence of these international courts. And at the same time, those repressions in Crimea, I would like journalists to understand this, and I see that you are real professionals. You understand this issue deeply, and Ukrainian society should understand this. They try to present that Ukraine suffers from this junta in Kiev, and this junta should be thrown away, and they do the same with Crimean Tatars. They say that these are Islamic extremists, terrorists, and when we win, Crimean Tatars will be happy in the Russian Crimea. We have time for one more question, dear colleagues. Victoria Blazova, their channel. Today we have anniversary of Seyran Murtaza's disappearance in Crimea. He tried to find his disappeared friend Timur Semerdanov, and he met with Timur's wife, and he said, he told her that Timur Semerdanov maybe was seized by self-defense of Crimea, and no one saw Seyran Murtaza after this. So Russian occupation authorities started a criminal case, but we do not have any information where this person is. Tell us, please. What is this crime? Maybe it's not the only one in these 5 years of occupation. Thank you very much for your question. So I wrote this information about Seyran, and I thank you for reminding me about this case. Several days ago, there was a 5th anniversary when Timur Semerdanov was kidnapped, and in 4 days, Seyran Murtaza disappeared, and he was seized. After he met with relatives of Timur Semerdanov, there was a brief meeting, and it happened 300 meters from the house of Seyran Murtaza, and he left, and he didn't reach his home, and in 15 minutes his wife or his sister called Semerdanov relatives, and he said that he left home, and no one knows where he is, and 5 years passed. And first year, there were forced disappearances. First week, I believe, they had the task just to prevent the movement, and here we had Sentsov arrest, and after this there was disappearance of Timur and Seyran. Then other disappearances happened, kidnappings happened, and they were directed to stop the resistance movement. And Refat was abducted first. He was abducted from the square, and there is a videotape about his abduction. And I know this from the messages I got then and in some time later after this. In these first abductions, the participants of self-defense, they are to blame. It was headed by Mikhail Sheremet. Later he became a vice premier of the illegal government of Crimea. This is close friend of Sergei Aksyonov, so-called head of Crimea. Now he is appointed deputy of the State Duma of Russia, and I confirm that Mikhail Sheremet is one of the killers of those people who were abducted in the first months, and this was done by a Russian occupation authority. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for being with us today. I would like to thank you. And you should understand the situation of Tatars in Crimea. Here we have information that law enforcers arrested one of the activists of Crimea, Halide Bekirova, and now she is brought to center against extremism. And so this is the first case when they detained a woman in such a case, and this case of 24. Many of these people were brought to administrative justice by the Extremism Counteraction Center, and later on they started criminal investigation against them. That's why I believe there will be a new wave, and I'm afraid that women also will be detained. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your attention. Thank you for those who came from Crimea. We understand that these people, they really risk when they cross the border between Crimea and the mainland Ukraine. I would like to remind you that Yanikov and Zuhra Amana were present in this hall, and their relatives also were detained and they were subjected to torture. So in the course of this, Fatima is lacking 3 people now in her family. That's why they are ready to speak with you. Thank you very much.